one thing about Mark Tobey was that he was based in Seattle, so he wasn't so much part of the New York scene, and therefore is sometimes left out of the story when people talk about abstract expressionism. But his work was shown in New York. He had a dealer there. So anyway, it can be tied back to Jackson Pollock. I had a conversation with Jackson Pollock's his widow, Lee Krasner, who's a significant artist in her own right, and she told me that Pollock had seen Tobey's work. So there's some kind of direct link back to Pollock. Although Pollock he died when I was about 2 years old, but he died really young, so I did have a chance to talk to his widow. I talked to his elder brother as well, Charles, who's also a painter, but not a very famous one. Lavender Mist. I think this is a good one. This is 1950. That's a good one to talk about this issue of the danger of the decorative, that this kind of art could push over into being merely decoration. This kind of pretty kind of colouring that he's using here. So when he uses certain kind of collaging of elements into this painted surface, the encrusted surface, I think that's one way of trying to work against that decorative quality. In this case, I suppose he's deliberately pushing the painted web to be so complex that you can't quite work out the individual marks. It's really different anyway to Autumn Rhythm, right, which is very sparse. So within these poured works, there is quite a lot of variety in terms of the effects. And this also has much more linear kind of quality to it in the way he's put on the paint that is different from some of the others. So this sort of lavender that gives the work its title, it kind of breaks up space, makes it very optically more disturbed, breaks up the linear web underneath. So there's a certain kind of creation by subtraction. Each layer takes away something from the layers that are there before it. You create by destroying. And then in 1951 to 1952, there's quite a radical change. He gets rid of colour altogether, basically. Produces a whole sequence of works which are just in black and white. There's a show just of these black and white works at the Betty Parsons Gallery. And it's not just that he's going to black and white, he's also allowing imagery to come back up in his works again. It's still an ambiguous imagery most of the time. I wouldn't like to really be able to say what is the subject matter of number 14 of 1951, what we're looking at here, but I definitely feel there are things here in a way that there aren't things in this image. You feel there's some sort of object here, which some sort of shading. It has boundaries. There's stuff here, solid stuff. What the hell it is hard to say, but there's something. Maybe these look like eyes or something. It's really difficult to read. Just to show how difficult it is to read. And also, I suppose, to talk about art historians' desire to find meaning, to pin down meaning. Here's a couple of different accounts that different art historians have made of this work, just to see what you think of their interpretations. This is someone called Carmian, quite a well-known scholar. He says, at the upper right we find a nearly closed white oval or crescent, whose definition and orientation follow that of the profile of the Weeping Magdalene. This is in Picasso's Crucifixion of 1930. At the opposite end we can read the broader white oval form as a continuation of the St. John figure, also derived from the source painting. Here there is also a suggestion of the staring eyes of Picasso's painting. The juxtaposition of these two figures with the painting's horizontal centre passage suggests that this central area represents the two dead thieves and the body of Christ, watched over by the Magdalene and St. John. So that's to see it as a kind of Christian image of a crucifixion. I don't know how convincing you find that, but this is how difficult it is. Well, here's someone else, Francis V. O'Connor, who wrote the catalogue raisonné of Pollock's work, the complete catalogue of his paintings. The sexual implications of this configuration are best understood, not in terms of explicit sexual congress, but in terms of the figure-protagonist-artist struggle in these works of 1951 to re-establish his sense of and capacity for relationship. The overriding drama of all these dark paintings is the eternal struggle to break away from the stranglehold of the mother complex and to assert first independence and then willingness to risk freely and knowingly love. Well, yeah, two quite different readings. That's obviously a sort of Freudian reading, and I think that that's on the right wavelength to think about the unconscious. The danger is, though, of trying to be too specific. Surely, the point is we can't work out what it means. It's like if we go all the way back to the Guardians of the Secret. I think the point is it's a sort of indecipherable secret that is in the centre of the painting. We're not meant to be able to work it out, but we're meant to be sort of struggling to do so. And isn't it really the same thing here, that we're meant to have a sense of something there, and it's all our engagement with it allows our own personal unconscious to go to work with the images and make them sort of come alive, find meaning in them. The very incompleteness of meaning leaves a space for our own unconscious to engage with the imagery, and maybe we see different things at different times. There's a sort of fluidity of engagement going on. In these works, I think you would want to say that the white of the canvas plays a more positive role than before. Partly, what he's doing here is a slightly different technique. And he's still pouring paint, but he's pouring the paint into a sort of unprimed canvas support, allowing it to soak in. There's more a sense of the painted marks are in the canvas rather than on the canvas. It's not exactly quite like watercolor, but it has that. You have a question?
Is he still using white paint that matches?
No, it's only black paint on the white surface. And what he did, he had a big roll, like a sailmaker's canvas, very large scale canvas, a big roll, and he'd unroll it almost like a massive Chinese scroll painting and work on one image at a time. And then he would cut it up, decide what images would be which. He didn't decide the framing in advance, he just decided the framing afterwards. I don't know, maybe in a work like this you could imagine perhaps he put down masking tape. Sometimes that could be a way of working, but certainly in some of the images there's no sign of that kind of thing. So that links the form and the even though there are a sense of forms, it doesn't destroy the all over composition because of the way the black soaks into the canvas, and you're aware of the black marks as marks still to a large extent, as you were in the earlier poured painting. So images returning, whether it's a kind of return to his unconscious, he wants to, his alcohol problem has come back at this point, so maybe has something in his unconscious life he wants to deal with, and images are what is Edith, he says, I'm very representational some of the time and a little all of the time.
Those two readings that you've just
Yeah,
shared with us,
yeah.
did he ever get a chance to read those himself?
No, those are all after his death. Yeah, and he never talks himself in that kind of way about his images. He always talks in a very, I think, in a very nice sort of matter-of-fact way about his works. He doesn't try to kind of tell you how to interpret them, you know. What is going on here? Well, part of it, there's many different dimensions to this. Part of it could be, you know, he's invented a signature style that he's become so well known for, but can you get trapped in that way? You know, if you become known for doing one thing, not just as an artist, but as a musician or for all kinds of areas of life, if you become famous for doing one thing, you know, like Hugh Grant always plays a certain kind of characters in movies. You know, I'm sure movie directors think, well, no, this is not really a Hugh Grant type of movie. You know, we'll look for someone else. You know, you can get typecast or you can get trapped in a certain kind of approach that is so distinctively you. Where do you go from there? Maybe after you've worked out all the themes and variations and possibilities of that, where do you then go? I think he was in a little bit of a bind like that of how to take his, without just abandoning his visual language that he's developed and invested all these years in and had so much success with, but then where do you go with that? You can't just carry on doing the same thing, but you can't sort of go back without somehow invalidating what you've done. So it's not a bad solution. He's finding a way to go back to images but still keeping his pouring method. It's sort of a way forward. Portrait and a Dream, 1953. Well, yeah, it's like maybe on the roll he had two separate images, but then decides to keep them together. That's possibly what happened. Frame them as one. They seem very different. There's a kind of gap between them. One is very definitely a kind of face, but it's a kind of fragmented face. It's a sort of post-cubist kind of fragmentation. The other one is much more difficult to make out. People might want to see a sort of bodily imagery in there, but it's very, very difficult to be sure. This one is a little bit different in that he's added some colour on, and he's also moved beyond just using pouring. So he's gone back to more traditional modes of applying paint. So he's struggling with his alcoholism. I think it's well worth noting, I think, how many of the great successes of American culture are made by people who are really on the margins of society in one way and another. You know, of course, his paintings is in the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, or whatever. We think of him as sort of successful artist, but this is a guy who, you know, destroyed a lot of his early paintings because he thought they were just rubbish. You know, he's been in car crashes, he's been in prison, he's been in a mental hospital, he's been drunk, you know. Or same thing if you want to look, what's another great success of American culture of the 20th century is jazz. So many of those great jazz artists were you know, heroin addicts or whatever. They were mostly black, so by definition at that point in time they were socially marginal. They had to sit at the back of buses or only go into certain restaurants and so forth. Charlie Parker, the great saxophone player of the bebop era, he has a tune called "Relaxing at Camarillo." Camarillo is the name of a mental hospital where he was forced to go to relax. These are people right at the edge of culture, and yet they are the only ones who really produce the fantastic kind of breakthroughs. So it's a kind of interesting phenomenon. Occasionally in these late work you find some sort of breakthrough. So in 1952, the Blue Poles. He's going back to his signature idiom and finds a way of pushing it a little bit further forward because of these kind of vertical, the blue poles of the title, giving his web something to dialogue with. I think one difference you can see here is you can see paint pouring down. Almost all of the images that he's produced, they are worked on the floor, and then only after they dried are they moved to a vertical dimension. So you, as I explained earlier, you don't have a sense of gravity in the world that he's created for you. But in Blue Poles you do. He's put it up on a vertical surface, so gravity intrudes into his, into his universe. Finally, is that a bad thing? This was bought by the Australian National Gallery in Canberra. They paid in 1973. They paid $2 million for it, which was a national outrage, a sort of scandal of discussion of should they have spent so much public money on it. Of course, now it would be worth much more than that. So that's often an argument people will make about these expensive works of art that have been bought. Okay, maybe what if you sell it? We can make much, much more back. But despite a sort of isolated success like this, a lot of his late work is struggling in a way. I put this in out of sequence, but it's also an example of him struggling with how to find other ways through from using his signature language. Funnily enough, some of that went on right at the very beginning, just as he was defining it, rather than at the end when he's trying to escape it. So this is from 1949, Out of the Web. He's created a web painting on a masonite, a board, and then he's cut with a knife through to expose the actual material on which it's painting. So he found a way to go back to figuration without abandoning his signature idiom, even right at this very early stage. It has a sort of figurative-like quality that's hard to read the forms, but they're like sort of figures, against the backdrop of the web. But he's achieved figuration without going back to drawing outlined forms. He's just cut through the web to get at them. And here's another solution that he used. Again, this is 1948, even earlier, the Wooden Horse number 10A. It's a collage solution as a way of introducing imagery back into a web painting. Perhaps inspired by Picasso's sculptures made from the collage principle of putting together two found objects or two or more found objects, and like a bull's head made from a cycling handlebars and seat, things like that. Probably it's a piece of driftwood from when he's walking along his nearby beach that he'd like to do. or part of a child's toy. It has that kind of childhood quality about it. You can relate it back to some of the drawings that Picasso did for Guernica, the horse in Guernica even. Maybe Picasso sort of in his head. One more example of these sort of late works where he is still using his signature idiom but trying to find a new way through with it. The Deep of 1953. It's okay, but it's a sort of isolated example, and in the end I find it's a little bit sort of dead somehow. It doesn't quite work. You may disagree, but it doesn't quite work the same way as the classic dripped poured paintings do. And one other late work, 1953, Easter and the Totem, where he's really abandoned that whole signature idiom and gone back to painting with a brush. And again, it's figurative subject matter, but a little bit hard to identify. Amorphous figurative forms, their bodies, probably human bodies, but a little bit hard to work out a narrative. Title Easter and the Totem brings in a sort of mythic dimension. The colours maybe remind me a little bit of Matisse. Maybe we're looking at the other great individual master of early 20th century modernism that hasn't actually figured very much as an influence on Pollock up to that point, but maybe it's coming through here. So difficult for him to find a way beyond his mature style, and maybe that's one of the reasons why he ends up dying so young. It's sort of a kind of suicidal death, a death in a kind of car crash, a reckless drunken car ride that you could call probably suicidal. Difficult for him to find a way, it's almost like his life ends because his art ends, something like that. With Gorky it was a similar story. And it's not only was it difficult for him to find a way beyond what he was doing, it's difficult for other artists coming after him to do so as well. So in a direct sense it's hard to see other artists taking up his lessons. He's the important artist for many people, but you can't really follow directly in his footsteps. So an artist like William de Kooning has many more followers than Jackson Pollock does, because he's using a brush. It's somehow more a kind of idiom that you can engage with without just copying the person that you're doing. If you try to use Pollock's method, you become a kind of a fake Pollock. Eventually there are artists who find a way of engaging with him, and often these are artists who are concerned with process in its own right. We'll see in the 1960s that his influence, performance art, happenings, all of these things, it's almost hard to imagine it without what Jackson Pollock did. So his influence is widespread and long-term, but less immediate in a way. You have to do something a little bit different from him before you can find a way to be influenced by him, it seems. We'll come to that in due course. So we'll just start making a look at some of the other abstract expressionists. I'll spend a little bit less time on each individual one than I have on Jackson Pollock. I wanted to kind of really give you something in depth about him as a kind of handle at the beginning of the course that you could hold on to and feel, well, at least there's one thing here I've really got a handhold on. So we'll move a little bit more quickly now. De Kooning. I said at the very beginning when I'm talking about abstract expressionism that there were two kinds broadly of abstract expressionists, those who use gestural marks and those who use colour fields. So the colour field painters, we'll get to those in a moment. Those are artists like Newman, Rothko and Still. But with De Kooning we're looking still at gestural approaches to painting. He's an abstract expressionist, but for most of his career, he's not making abstract paintings. The term is not that helpful, really. It doesn't take us very far. He's an artist. Remember when both for Gorky and for Pollock, we've seen artists who take a long, long time to find their mature style. That's partly because they're provincial artists. America was a provincial country for modern art at that time. So that puts you in a difficult situation. How do you get to be working at the front edge of things? But it's also, I think, to do with the general economic situation these artists grew up in. They're growing up in the wake of the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. They're coming of age during the Great Depression. There are very few economic opportunities. Who's buying art? Nobody's buying art. It's not the booming art market of the 1980s or of the 2000 and the first decade of the 21st century. Maybe it's starting to be a little bit less dynamic, the art market now, the last few years, but still pretty big. Different kind of environment. They're bohemians, outsiders, nobody really cares. That's all going to it's a lost generation in many ways. They living through the aftermath of the Great Depression. Then what's the next thing to come along is the Second World War. They're a wartime generation. Again, people are postponing their lives till after the war is over before they can really get on with what they want to do. Most of these pioneer abstract expressionists are too old to be fighting in the war, but still, it's all part, or they're just not healthy enough, if you're Jackson Pollock or something, to be called up. So at the margins of society, there's all these reasons why it takes them a long time, and De Kooning amongst them, to find their own breakthrough idiom. He was born in Rotterdam in Holland, a port city, studied in evening classes at the Rotterdam Academy of Fine Arts and Techniques while he was still a teenager up till the age of 20. In 1926 he emigrated illegally to the United States, so he's living actually as an illegal immigrant. Again, socially marginal by definition. So much of the story, I've said this before, but so much of the story of the 20th century is the story of migrants. Pollock is not a migrant, but Rothko is a migrant, De Kooning is a migrant. He doesn't become a US citizen until 1961, in fact. That's really quite late on. Must be some kind of amnesty took place at that time. He got by working as a house painter, doing commercial artwork, sign painting and so forth when he first arrived, probably up to the middle part of the 1930s. In 1929 he met some quite well-known American artists like Stuart Davis. A little later on he met Gorky, who we've been looking at. He met Pollock in 1942. In 1935 he got work on a federal art project doing murals. So artists were given paid artwork as a kind of social security thing in the Depression era. his first solo exhibition was in 1948. Yeah, just think about it. He's 44 years old before he has his solo exhibition. Even in Hong Kong, many young artists are getting solo exhibitions within a year or two of graduating from their BA, BFA, It's the mid-1950s before he's starting to actually sell his work in a satisfactory way. Becoming, actually fame came before wealth, for a lot of these artists. Like Picasso, like Pollock, he moved out of New York City, but rather late on. He moves also to East Hampton on Long Island, but in 1963. But we'll see that there's actually a sort of shift in his art around that time because of the moving out of the city. So I'm doing what I like to do, showing early works. Well, here we are. Seated figure, classic male, 1940. Something of Picasso, something of Gorky. I'm talking about Gorky's early work, things like this that we saw. They were really quite close. So that I won't go into it all, but you can see a certain kind of parallel in what they're doing at that time. At this time, he says, of all movements, I like Cubism the most. It had that wonderful unsure atmosphere of reflection, a poetic frame where something could be possible, where an artist could practice his intuition. Pink Angel, around 1947, so just after the Second World War. It's again very much in using a vocabulary derived from Cubism, as his friend Gorky had also been doing, the so-called Picasso of Washington Square. The fragmentation is much more clear in this work, and in fact it's fragmented in a way that Cubist art often isn't. It's almost a sense of violence to the figures, breaking the figures down. Remember, this is just after the Second World War, just after the discovery of the horrors of the death camps, after Hiroshima, all these things. A certain kind of violence in the work may be related to that particular time it's being made. Sometimes he would use like cardboard templates and draw around them to create forms, maybe using the same template more than once, that sort of thing. Got these sort of rhythmic shapes. That's not particularly Cubist. It's a little bit similar to what you see in certain Gorky works. There's a lot of tentativeness in De Kooning's work all the way through, the sense of reworking, do something, change it. In a work like this, you can see the marks of reworking. He lets you see his ambivalences, his changes of minds. The process of it is laid bare. It's fragmented like a Cubist painting, but even more so, it has that sense of not quite sure, maybe this way, maybe that way. There's no final, resolved, static composition. Always ambiguous. The anxiety of choice. This is the age of existentialism. Existentialist philosophy, existence precedes essence. We have to decide our own meaning, and that's difficult. We don't know, should we do this, should we do that? It's all down to us to decide. The anxiety of choice. Once someone asked De Kooning, how do you know when a work is finished? This is a very big question to ask artists at this time, and he replied, I refrain from finishing it. He doesn't want to get to a state of resolution. The pink colour, it makes me think of Picasso's sort of rose period. The same thing here, I think that's one of the influences. And Picasso, not just Picasso of the early Cubist era, but Picasso as a contemporary artist. I made this point before. He's still alive and making art, and people are interested in what he's doing next. So I would relate this to some Picasso works of the 1930s, bathers on beaches and things like that, relatively recent works. Even to Futurism or Duchamp, New Descending the Staircase, those images of capturing a sense of motion. That's something we get here, a sense of movement. Yeah, there is an interest. Having said that, there is also, I think, this interest in early Cubism, the so-called Analytical Cubism. This is Picasso's Vollard, which you don't see so much amongst the others. That's one way I distinguish him from Gorky or Pollock, really. That interest in Analytical Cubism as well as in the later, more synthetic Cubism. But this is what I mean by the slightly later works by Picasso that I think he's also interested in. A Bather by the Sea. I think that's a sort of feeds into this. This is Picasso with a little touch of surrealism in him, the way that the face of the bather becomes almost like insect-like. You're looking at skin, you're also as if looking at bone, looking through to what's underneath the skin. So all of these things being put together. Then 1948, a move to abstraction. So for a while he was an abstract artist. Maybe for 2 years or 3 years he's making works which are more or less abstract. This is painting of 1948. Some kind of quick splashy approach to painting. It's not pouring paint like Pollock, but Pollock is an influence. He said Jackson broke the ice, that he's the one who made the first breakthrough, enabled other artists to find their own individuality. Compared to Pollock, it's still, you have a sense of solid things there. These little kind of forms you can imagine him drawing around the template or something to create them. There's a sense of form against backgrounds, a solidity which you don't get in Pollock. But it's still a pretty dynamic composition. Reducing everything to black and white. We saw black and white at the later phase with Pollock, but for De Kooning, it's part of his initial breakthrough. Maybe if to focus on one thing, you get other things out of the way. Let's get colour out of the way so we can focus on what we're doing in terms of a breakthrough in some other dimension. It's not really close to surrealism, unlike Pollock or Gorky, but there's a little bit here I'm saying of surrealist automatism maybe that helping him. And also, like Pollock, he's not just using artist paints, he's using household paints and enamel paints. Remember, he was doing some house painting to earn his living, so he's used to handling those kind of things. He's using house painters' brushes as well. If you're working on a larger scale, maybe different tools are helpful. Beyond sophistication and a kind of arty feel. There is something of a kind of all-over feel in a work like this, even though it's not really, it still has solid form in it. But there's still some kind of cubistic structuring going on at the same time. It's not like Pollock's sort of loss of self in the creative process. He's always controlling things, manipulating, organising things. There is stuff in his art. It's not that loss of self-consciousness. he talks about his love of Dutch painting, which is always, full of stuff, Dutch still life. He says, although I don't care for all the pots and pans in the painting of the burghers, he's speaking as a Dutch artist himself, I do like the idea that the pots and pans I mean, are always in relation to man. They have no soul of their own, like they seem to have in the Orient. For us, they have no character. We can do anything we please with them. So it's like a sort of still life mentality, even though there's no specific still life objects to be found. The still life artist is the artist who physically tactile manipulation of things within arm's reach, doing what you want with them, arranging them as you want. You can't do that with a landscape. You can't move trees around physically in a landscape, but you can move objects around for us arranging a still life. Excavation, 1950, one of the last and largest of these major abstract paintings. I think there's a sort of bodily imagery here, although it's all very fragmented. It's like the fragmentation of analytical cubism, breaking things down. Still it's a kind of post-cubist painting. They're human bodies. I see these as teeth. Fragmented human figures. People have said that this is influenced by a particular film he saw, or film stills, images from a film called Bitter Rice. It's an image of some women standing in water up to their knees, I suppose planting rice or something, I don't know. I've never seen that film, so I don't know the first thing about it. Excavation, that implies a sort of landscape kind of urban imagery. Certainly we know that there was a lot of building work going on outside his studio at the time. One critic described it as a sort of fleshy jigsaw, which I think is not a bad way of putting it together. Little bit of colour, but still basically the conception is a black and white conception. He liked to work at night, and when he was in New York, so all this sort of black and white would fit well with that. I think that's actually a good place to stop, because suddenly there's a big transformation in his work where he goes back to the figure. Shockingly for some people, an abandonment of abstract art. So we can come back to look at that next week, before going on to look at Rothko and Newman and other members of the Abstract Expressionist circle.